welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. This is Keep It Real. I think it's 33, if I'm not mistaken, but either way, we'll correct that if we need to. We got me and Doug today. What do we got, Doug? What are you going to ask me about?
I wanted to go over some baseball questions because for people that don't know, we actually work in different locations. So sometimes the only time that we communicate, formally during the week is doing these podcasts. We don't get to exchange ideas as much as we would like. So just because, you've kind of fallen into this baseball niche over there, I have some questions for you just because I'm not working with as many baseball players and throwers and overhead athletes, but I don't think a lot of people know about you that before you became a physical therapist, you were actually a minor league strength coach for the Arizona Diamondbacks. And obviously I know that, but I don't even think I know how you fell into that role. So what was the genesis of that, coming from New Jersey and ending up in Arizona?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely not part of the plan forever. Like I always just thought I was going to go right to PT school immediately after undergrad, like most students do. Um, but in my last semester, it actually might have been like the summer after I graduated, I think. I was like on campus and met a guy who used to work for the New York Mets. He was a strength coach for like the major league team, and he was like friends with a professor, so he was on campus or whatever. And I just was like, I have to talk to this guy. Like I played baseball in college. I was interested in physical therapy, and like I just wanted to make this connection and meet this guy and be able to maybe ask him some questions and maybe develop a relationship, like as you try and do when you're somebody new to a field. And he like right off the bat was like, you should just try and be a strength coach for a major league baseball team. I was like, what are you talking about? Like why would that even be an option for me? Like I don't know shit, I'm 22 years old, like just graduated college. He's like, no, that's perfect, like that's what they look for to fill the minor leagues. Like,
No,
yeah,
no
like no.
credentials.
What's that?
No credentials. You're just the right guy.
Yeah. I didn't have my CSCS yet. I think I got it at the fall after graduating. But he was pretty much like, if you went through this department, this program, like a kinesiology program at the College of New Jersey, like I think you can probably take that and a team would be interested as long as you're willing to learn and you're motivated, you're driven, like you have an interest in baseball, like it'd be a great situation. And then if it doesn't work, like you can go to PT school, or if it's just something that you want to experience and learn from. And that's how it worked out. I was pretty much like, all right, well, what do I do? And he's like, just go on like the NSCA website and they post jobs. Like all these major league baseball teams or other sports teams will post jobs to try and fill positions, because there's a lot of turnover in those roles, in those lower level like minor league roles. There's an enormous amount of turnover, whether people go to different organizations or they just wind up not liking the field or whatever. And I applied to like maybe seven or eight different teams. Most of the positions wanted like experience, so I don't know, I just submitted it anyway. And it wasn't even one of those positions that I interviewed for that I wound, like the Diamondbacks don't post their jobs on the NSCA, at least they didn't then. But I had interviewed for like the Kansas City Royals, wanted somebody in like high A or double A, which I wasn't qualified for, but the guy gave me a call anyway. And he was friends with my former boss, who's now actually the Yankees strength coach, Brett McCabe. They like shared a cab at winter meetings. It was like the most random thing. And the Kansas City Royals guy was like, hey, do you have anybody that, or my former boss, sorry, Brett McCabe asked the Royals guy, do you have any applicants, or do you guys, do you have anybody that you think might be a good fit? We're looking for some more rookie ball strength coaches. And that's like how it all happened. Gave him my number. I wound up interviewing with like the entire Diamondbacks, like major and minor league staff. I probably spoke to like 7 different people on their staff in like 2.5 days. And they made the offer the fastest compared to any other team that I spoke to. And I just took it and wound up soon after, like I was personal training at that time. I hated it, not for me. I had my CSCS, so it was just a quick turnover from, I think it was like December, I probably stopped working as a personal trainer. And then in February, was when like the Diamondback stuff started, and um, yeah, that's kind of like how I even got into that role. And I think, I mean, for anybody who's interested in getting into professional baseball, it's mainly just meeting people, like being nice to people, getting to know them, like asking questions, being genuinely interested and willing to learn. And like that's your foot in the door. And I don't think that's unique to baseball. Like I don't think that's unique to any job really. Like that's just kind of how you should operate when you're trying to make connections and meet people and get your foot in the door, so to speak. So that's kind of like how it all started.
Okay, yeah. So, and I didn't even know that story. So it's crazy that we've known each other this long, and I didn't never thought to ask like, how did you end up there? But that's really coincidental. So the plan was always to go to PT school. You called an audible and ended up applying for the strength coach job. But you mentioned that if people like take the initiative, these jobs are available, but you also kind of have to pay your dues. So just so people have an idea, because I do know you spoke more about this with me, like it's it's a very unique situation to be like a minor league strength coach. And I think some of it was a trial by fire because it was like your first strength coaching job with the team, but you also had some great mentorship. So maybe like looking back on it, what were some of the things you look back on where you're like, wow, I was like really unprepared for that. I don't know how I kind of faked my way through it. But then also if you could talk about, because we know some of the people on the Diamondback staff now that were there even when you were working with them. And I think it's one of those things where sometimes when you get mentorship, you don't know how good it really was until you've been on your own for a while to really appreciate like what it is that you were taught. Like when you're a student and you're learning or you're a mentee, you're kind of like, well, these people are nice to me. They're taking the time to teach me. So you're like, that's good. But you don't really know how good something is until you have context and you treat it on your own. And I think you could probably look back on that experience and really appreciate like the approach and the philosophy that the like that staff instilled in you. So can you talk about like the challenges and then just kind of the mentorship that you received and how you've come to appreciate it over the years?
Yeah, definitely. The challenge of getting into something like that is that it has to be like the right point in your life. Like it's really hard to uproot a family for a job that was, I think I made probably like $20,000 or something that first year. Like you can't just, unless like money is not an issue for you, you can't just like uproot your family and move across the country or just leave your family. So like for me, it was right out of college. It was the perfect situation where I didn't really have obligations. But that's definitely like the first hurdle and something difficult if you wanted to get into it. Um, and then you're a million percent correct with like not really knowing how good things are around you until you've not been there for a while. Because like I always tell people like anything that I do now clinically was inspired or like I was introduced to by the Diamondbacks. I might not have like developed the expertise or like fully learned the skills or whatever it is that I do now, but it was all stuff that they were all doing, and it was always something that they were trying to trickle down through their system so that they could continually grow their staff to like kind of like replace itself and everybody kind of grows with the organization. So yeah, I mean, like, I think one of the best things that they did was they allowed you to kind of like explore they would just show you a bunch of stuff and let you kind of like gravitate towards whatever you gravitated towards. And definitely like looking back, I was, looking at what are the other people ahead of me doing? What is the AAA strength coach doing? The AA strength coach, like what are the higher up positions? Like what are those people doing? I should probably do what they're doing. And even that, like at that time, that was probably inappropriate because they were doing higher level stuff because they had already been working in this role for years, whereas this is my very first job besides personal training. This is my very first like career job where, um, like I was extremely green. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Like terrible, not a lot of good coaching experience. Um, and yeah, like, but that was what they wanted is like, what are you interested in? What do you kind of gravitate towards? And then it's like, go all in with it. So at the time, the Diamondbacks were hosting a lot of like DNS courses in the off season. They were on like kind of a big DNS kick at that time where they would host every single level of the course that they possibly could in America. And we would just fit in wherever we are in that sort of that pipeline. So like I took DNSA, and then like now 5 years later, 5 years ago, and now 5 years after I left, they were more into like a PRI approach. So they're always doing a bunch of different things, just kind of like try to take as much as they can from different things, which again is like they showed their hand of like, this is all of the stuff we like. So kind of like pick something and just start learning about it. And I would say like, history shows us that we kind of gravitated more towards like a PRI background or approach to, like our biomechanical model, let's say. And they were doing, the AA, AAA guys were doing a lot of the PRI stuff that I might do now. And at the time, like I probably shouldn't have even been spending any time really learning that, because like I needed to do a better job like coaching a push-up and row and squat and deadlift, all like the normal strength training type of movements. But I think the job itself, working in season, a lot of the players I worked with were either right out of high school or out of college, where they had never played this much baseball in their lives. They've never played every single day of their life, where like they were all pretty trashed. Like they were all pretty beat up just from like being on field. You might be on the field for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. And like you've only had to do like a high school practice for an hour or two up until then and play like 2 or 3 games a week or whatever. So a lot of the training stuff we were doing seemed more therapeutic. It seemed more like in the lines of like corrective exercise sort of stuff. So like that was what most of the people were doing outside of basic, just like lunge sort of stuff. So I definitely gravitated towards like, well, I need to kind of learn how to make people feel better and move better so that they feel good enough to actually play tomorrow. Like I'm not just going to go, we weren't in heavy trap bar deadlifts, in season with a position player when, they played a game last night and they got to bed at 1 a.m. or even later because their sleep schedules are just all messed up. I think I'm rambling a whole lot, but I think that kind of answers some of
Yeah,
your
and then
question.
people talk about like people talk about pro sports like it's this glamorous thing, but minor league baseball is technically pro sports, but that might be the most unglamorous part, like
Yes.
sector of pro sports, or one of them. Like, you talk about
And it's different now.
you're eating it like McDonald's, like a gourmet meal, right? Like that's people talk about like optimization and like having the absolute best nutrition, sleep, travel. I mean, can you talk about like how shitty just some of that stuff is in minor league baseball? Because I don't think some people have any idea if they haven't worked in it.
Yeah, and I think I had it good for where I was. Like I was in the Northwest League, and the whole minor league system's been restructured now. So there's a lot of fewer teams. So there's fewer jobs, fewer players, like just more money allocated towards the minor league teams now because fewer teams. So I think things are definitely a bit better now. But I did have it good where in the Northwest League, I was in Yakima, Washington, which the team doesn't exist anymore. We were right in the middle of the rest of the league. So all of our road trips were really not that bad. Like I think our longest trip might have been like 6 hours or 7 hours. So if we were in, like I think the furthest team north was like Vancouver, British Columbia, and then the furthest south or whatever, furthest away was like Boise, Idaho. So like that road trip is probably going to be like 12 hours. So like my life was kind of like relatively easy in terms of like being on a bus. The staff, everyone had your own 2 seats, so I could kind of lie down if I wanted to. All the players had to share, and of course, like the older players like kicked all the younger kids aside. So like it definitely wasn't as bad as I think being a player, because I didn't actually have to perform after a 6-hour bus ride either. And not that they would just come off the bus and show up, but it was definitely easier for me. But yeah, like you say, it's not glamorous. We'd have $100 a day we could spend to have a spread of food for like a pregame meal, like a
For the whole
lunchtime
team.
meal. The whole team, $100. So, which actually, again, like at the time was the most from any of the other organizations that I was talking to. So we again had it good where like I had cold cuts and cheeses and bread and like tons of fruit, vegetables. The organization Diamondbacks would ship in different sorts of like protein powders and things. I think a lot of it was also just kind of like given to the organization as like promotional material to try and get the guys to use their products and stuff. So, but that was like a normal spread. And that was good because usually it's just like, oh, and then there'd be like peanut butter and jelly, but usually it would just be like peanut butter and jelly and that's it, and good luck. But then, yeah, dinners would be like a burger, hot dog from like the stadium that you're in with like French fries. And then, yeah, like if you're gonna get a meal on the road, it's like a fast, it's like Sonic, I remember, or like, yeah, McDonald's. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was definitely not glamorous, and uh, but it could have been worse at the same time for sure. But yeah, like you say, it's like people talk about optimization, and there's all these. You could take a course on anything now and learn about how to optimize sleep or this and that, and nutrition. Of course, all these things are important. They're not important, but it's really hard to know what actually is going on with pro athletes and what they're actually required to do, and it's really challenging and it's not healthy. um, but yeah, like I wasn't talking to these guys about like, oh, make sure you have your like you turn your blue lights off an hour before you sleep. It's like, no, they're not gonna either A, they're not gonna listen, or like if they do, it's you're polishing a turd because they just played an extra inning game, and like they had a workout in the morning because we didn't know it was going to be an extra inning game, so like their day was even longer than it probably could have been or should have been. And then it's like they got to wake up and do it all over again tomorrow. And the schedule for the day, like we'd show up to the stadium around like noon, or the players maybe around like 1. You do like some sort of quick dynamic warm up, hopefully on your own, and you would do what's called extra work. So it's all like individual stuff, but everyone on the team did extra work. So you do your extra work, come back in, then we would do like a team warm up, and then do like pregame practice, essentially like ground balls and batting practice and stuff. And then throw their bullpens, and then there's a game, and then after the game, you might want to, if you had a bad day, like you might want to go take some swings in the cage. So like it's a long day. Like they'd show up at, like I said, 12 or 1, and we'd be there until like 12 or 1. And it was, I think I had 3 days off in 3 months. So it's and one of those days I was on a bus. So it's not even an off day. Um, but yeah, definitely not glamorous, but it's, as the professional on the team and working with the guys, it was awesome. Like the guys on the team were very green like me, like just kind of interested in learning like how to change certain things in their routines, and at least most of them were. And they were kind of like along for the ride with me, so to speak. We kind of like learned together what works for them, and like how do I then use it to help other people.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard enough to do this stuff when you're chartering a private plane and staying in the best hotels, and that's far from the environment that you worked in. So when I hear about, like, people see these baseball players and their union getting these like big contracts, and it's like, oh, these guys are so selfish, but they pay their dues, and the ones who make it to that level and can, negotiate those contracts, it's not like they just showed up there. Like even the best players are riding those buses and eating, stadium hot dogs. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's good
you
to get
don't
a
know
look. What's that?
you don't know like how long you're going to have to do it for
Right.
either. So for
Yeah.
me, back then there was 7 levels of minor league baseball, and I was like in the bottom 3 position. The bottom 3 were kind of like equal, and then after that there was another 4 above us. So like I could have been in that role, and like it could have been a decade before I got to like a major league position. Who knows? Like I would have hoped that I could have done a good enough job and met enough people that I
Yeah.
could have kind of catapulted myself. But like looking back, the people that started the same year as me, one of them is a head trainer with the Brewers. One of them is a head trainer with the Twins. One of them is the minor assistant strength coach with the Diamondbacks. So like if you stay in it, you'll eventually kind of, and you do a good enough job, people like you, like you'll get to where you want to go. But it could take you, I think it probably took maybe like 8 years for these guys to kind of get to like their sort of like end goal of being a major league kind of like higher up type position. So like if you want to kind of just take it on the mouth for a while and get kicked in the teeth for 8 years and make no money and eventually get to a point where you're making a decent salary, uh, it's fun, it's great, but it's, yeah, it's definitely not glamorous.
Yeah, like you've kind of come full circle because you were doing that like 8, 10 years ago, and now you're treating a pretty similar population, like, a lot of high school, college baseball players. And so in the time that we have left, I wanted to kind of go over like almost like some rapid fire type, just things that like I would even like to know for myself because I'm not work with as many baseball players. And one of them would be when it comes to like assessing arms, working with pitchers, right? Like there's a certain degree of laxity and even like hypermobility in the joint that allows these athletes to throw hard, right? And then if they don't have enough like layback, let's say they have no chance of throwing hard. Do you have a way? Do you have a way of assessing on the table alone, like this person should have a range between like this much ER and this much ER, and that's the range that you want. Anything outside of that, whether it's too much or too little, is a red flag for you, or is it kind of hard for you to make that call devoid of like watching the athlete actually throw?
So I definitely think for like if you're talking specifically about like shoulder external rotation range of motion,
Yeah,
like I think for me that's probably like that and shoulder flexion are probably the most important things for me to see
yep,
because they're the most outside of what a normal human needs to be able to do.
right.
They're like kind of the most risky, and if you don't have them, that's a huge problem. So if I were to give like numbers, like I generally like to see about like 120 degrees, like they're lying supine. I kind of like just keep the shoulder down on the table and just bring it back into external rotation passively. I'd like to see that I can kind of get to like 120 and there's resistance around 120. I have guys that can get like where their arm is perpendicular to the floor. I don't think I can change that though. I don't think that I can actually like stiffen somebody up. And I talk about that a little bit in the webinar I just did for us this on our membership this month. If you want to sign up for that, go for it. But it's I did like a throwers plyometric arm care webinar and how I use plyometrics with my throwers. But yeah, like 120 degrees passively on the table is kind of like what I'm looking for. Where you throw, like where your arm angle is, like if you're more of like a sidearm guy, you can kind of like get away with a little bit less. Um, but generally speaking, that's what I'm looking for. Internal rotation, I care a little bit less about, but it's like, it's again, it's like, do you have enough? And like 45 degrees is probably not enough. I'm probably looking for like a minimum 70. Um, and that to me is more of like, that's like your runway. Like if you're going to land a plane, you have more time if you have more room to go. You just have more
Mm,
time to decide potentially. It's just, you're just jamming joints together. You have more space to before you're jamming joints together. So yeah, I think I'm not going to tighten somebody's shoulder up if they're like hypermobile, so to speak. But a lot of the interventions that I'll use will be more about stability or control.
right.
And I'll do that with plyometric, like with a weighted ball that's like the size of a baseball. Like driveline baseball's been extremely popular in the last decade, and they have these balls that are extremely popular. I know there's like other brands that probably make the same exact thing, but I'll use those balls as ways to train stability with a little bit of load and a little bit of speed. Where again, you're not throwing the ball for velocity purposes. I'm not doing it to train velocity, but I'm doing it to train the position and some stability. If you are one of those looser guys, and then I'll give you other things that might look similar to like if you've used a body blade before, people have definitely heard of that, like just shaking or where you're doing like rapid contract relax of antagonist agonist muscles, and you're trying to do that in different positions. And I'll do that like with a ball, which I think is again like more aggressive than potentially than using a body blade. I'll use things like clubs where the club can then like if you're holding the club back like almost like how you'd hold a hammer. I'll have people do things like that with their arm and kind of go through like Indian clubs, I think is how you
Yeah,
would actually call what those clubs are actually called. Do kind of like some of like the throwing movements with that where the torque of the club is creating an extra force because of just how long it is. Um, and a lot of these things I'm just picking based off of like which bucket are you in? Are you more of a stiffer guy or are you more of a looser guy? So for somebody who's stiffer, I'm definitely doing uh, I mean, I like to just break it down from like, well, we have to address everything from like the hips, rib cage, scapula before we can just start stretching somebody into external rotation. So if there's anything there that needs to be addressed, like maybe that they can't rotate their trunk as much to that arm side, that throwing side, so they might need to do some sort of corrective drill for that. Um, I kind of have my go-tos, which is we don't need to get into that right now, but um, and then I'll do a lot of manual therapy. And baseball players, like they need a lot of manual therapy, generally on their throwing arm. I think sometimes it can be overused, like maybe because the athlete wants it more than they might need it, but they feel they need it. But I'm definitely doing a good amount of manual therapy to try and get back to that like 120 kind of like magic number.
So then if someone showed up with like 110, that wouldn't you wouldn't be satisfied with that. Like, would you say like we need to get more of this? And at 110 is more than the normal range for a quote unquote normal person, but not for, a high level pitcher, which is the population you're working with. So if they're not like, if they're at like 100 or between 100 and 110, let's say, like, is that a problem for you where you're like, I've got to address this?
I would say generally no, because if I'm going to get them, if I'm getting them a cold, they haven't done a warm up, they haven't done anything, they just woke up, let's say,
Okay.
get them on the table. If they have 110, like I know they're going to get an extra 10 just from doing like a dynamic warm ups,
Sure.
mobility things, and even like just tossing a light weighted ball against the wall will actually give you an extra 10 degrees or whatever. I don't know what the numbers are, but
Right.
there will be short-term changes just from doing a few things that I know then they'll be safe when they actually go and throw.
Okay.
I think a lot of it might be more so like, what does the end feel like? What do those last 5 degrees feel like? And is the person like, sometimes I'll do that and like, it is kind of like a provocative position. And I'm often working with people who have pain. So they might also just be kind of guarding where they have a little bit more, but they're just not letting me do it because I'm the one doing it to them. And if I let them do it, they'd be able to kind of like rotate as much as they like. So there's like that sort of, fear about it potentially, just because it is such a strange position to get into. But no, if they're at 110, I'm not really worried. I might do a little bit of soft tissue just based on end feel or what they feel. Um, and if it's like, oh, I'm one of these guys where I get super sore, like my lat is always so stiff and like they're missing some shoulder flexion, like I'll hit their lat a little bit. We'll go do some, whatever hangs or like doorway stretch for the lat. It's like, all right, boom, you're good. You have 120 and I don't really have to worry about it.
Okay. But like, all right, somebody comes in with 90, you're not getting them to 120 in with some manual therapy and a warm up. Like,
Yes.
so I know you're treating people who are coming off.
So no, I would say, so I definitely would say that I could get somebody from 90 to 120 within like a 30-minute session because it happens. And had a college pitcher, medial elbow injury, only had 90 degrees of external rotation on the table the first time I saw him. And within that session, we can get him full external rotation without just cranking the shoulder by doing some sort of like rib cage positioning type things or scapula mobility type things. And then, yeah, like just even some light throws against the wall or like those club hold, like kind of like fake throwing movements, even just doing that stuff can get them 30 degrees of range of motion. And then it's like, all right, you just need more of this. And at this point now, the kid's been throwing with me. I think I threw 4 times yesterday. So I'm throwing pretty frequently because that's definitely like, if these kids are never throwing, you know, that's the goal. So they need to be able to throw. I'm going to make sure that they can throw and have pain-free throwing and work along a progression to get back to where they need.
What are you seeing more of these days? Like rotator cuff, shoulder type injuries, or more elbow, UCL type injuries?
100% elbow. I think elbow dominates the baseball world in terms of injuries. A lot of the shoulder stuff is more just like, it's like achy, pinchy, like I'm stiff sort of stuff, or like sore. Rotator cuff injuries are not too common actually in baseball, but I would say I do a lot of soft tissue on the rotator cuff, but there's not like a true actual injury there. That's actually a pretty small percentage of injuries in at least professional baseball. I think it's like, I think the number 6 is jumping into my head, where like 6% or something like that of injuries are like rotator cuff injuries. So it's definitely medial elbow issues are definitely the number one injury that I'm working with.
All right. And then, I mean, I know you're rehabbing a lot of Tommy John surgeries. And obviously there are certain, timeline based protocols, but for you, what are your kind of KPIs that like you don't feel comfortable with an athlete throwing until they can meet those benchmarks, whether they're like strength, range of motion? It might not even be traditional stuff. It might be you like some kind of weird exercise that if someone can do that, it gives you confidence that they're ready to throw. Like what are your kind of like return to throwing type things where you feel like, okay, if I can get an athlete to do X, Y, and Z, I've done my job as a physical therapist. Now it's kind of like on them and their sport coach to do the rest.
Yeah, definitely. So in most situations, most of the post-operative like Tommy John surgeries I deal with, they're mostly coming from one surgeon. And then I'll have a couple other kind of like more local surgeons that will not, it's usually not the surgeon that's here because they don't really typically know we exist until we've worked with one of their patients and then they hear about us. So I'd say, I don't know, in the last 12 months, I think I've had like 8 or 9 John surgeries, which is more than like pro sports actually handles on a yearly basis. So
How many? Because you
it's
kind of
not a
broke up.
good thing, but I've 8 or 9 in the last year,
Okay.
which is a lot to deal with. It's not obviously like, it sucks to have that many, but I'm glad that I can see so many because you see many of things, you get better at working with them and you know what you're looking for. So working backwards, typically they're throwing around week 18, maybe 17, just depends on when their follow-up appointment is with the surgeon. And then working backwards from there, I typically have them doing like single arm throwing plyometrics, like this stuff I went over in the webinar for this month, for about like 2 or 3 weeks. And then for the 2 or 3 weeks before that, they're typically doing more like intense med ball throws, like traditional like shot put stuff into a wall, rotational throws, slams, scoop tosses, and then 2 weeks or 3 weeks before that, I'll have them start doing like extensive plyometric med ball throws, where it's more just like chest pass into the wall, doing 20 reps, like getting a rhythm, kind of like how we would start people with extensive plyos with like an Achilles injury, then add intensity and add more like single leg sort of stuff. It's the same sort of progression with that. So it's generally like 2 or 3 weeks of each of those things. And if you just work your way backwards, that brings you to about like 8 weeks, maybe 9 weeks is when I'll start doing those extensive med ball throws into a wall or the floor. And then the only other real like sort of like important timeline for me would be like full range of motion. So like extension is typically around like week 4. They'll get full extension in their elbow as long as they've had that before and there's no like actual bony issue. And then, yeah, I mean, other than that, then I just, even like doing my range of motion and just assessing how the joint feels for them and for me every time I see them, it should just be freer. It's a very subjective thing, but like I don't want them to fight me anymore, and I want to be able to kind of like bounce the joint by about like week 8, probably the latest week 8, because that's what they're gonna have to start doing with med balls. And then yeah, I'll, like progressively, maybe week 4 or 5, I'll start to like actually bring them back into external rotation passively. And I'm only bringing them back into like what they want to do. And it's more just like probably more of like a pain sciencey type approach of like, they haven't gone there and they know that's a bad place to go if you have an elbow injury. So like I'm progressively showing them that they can go there pain-free, and they just start to get freer and freer and let you bring them into that, more provocative position. And that's probably the main stuff.
Any general stuff? I mean, is it kind of like, with an ACL injury where you talked about like a running progression? You mentioned Achilles, but like we would do extensive plyometrics, have like a running drill progression before somebody ran. But at least with an ACL, you've got to deal with like weakness and quad atrophy. Is there a similar type thing where you feel like there's general strength benchmarks outside of range of motion you want someone to meet before they go through like your med ball and extensive upper body plyo progression? Or is it not, not a good analogy with like using a lower body type surgery?
It's definitely different. I just try and relate it more so to like where they were before surgery. So as an example, college pitcher I have now is probably deadlifting like 385, let's say. And like before surgery, he was probably around like 405. So I'm like, all right, he's pretty much there. Like he can, I'm sure he can probably do 405 without an issue, but he's working his way up. Okay. And he's through like a very linear progression of slowly loading it more. So for me, like a trap bar deadlift is going to put a lot of strain on the tissue in the elbow and the grip and all that. So like that's an important thing for me. and it's all based on like where you were before. Like if you've never trap bar deadlifted and you're 15 years old and I have you a fresh Tommy John, I'm not going to have that same expectation, but I'm going to have them doing carries, and I'm going to have them doing things where I'm just loading, like tensile forces, let's say, and like strengthen and kind of like progressively challenging their grip strength. Of course, then a lot of the traditional stuff still plays with like forearm strengthening. Like I definitely like guys to like crush their forearm, their medial elbow, like wrist flexors, finger flexors. I like them to turn that into like a strength exercise, essentially, where you're doing that, 2 or 3 times a week with like a heavy load where you can only do like 8 reps. Like, yeah, you got to start with 5 pounds, but like you're not going to be doing much with 5 pounds if you're fully healthy and you're able to throw again. But I'm trying to like build up that medial elbow, that forearm as much as possible, strength wise. But I definitely don't have like minimum sort of numbers to look for. There's probably numbers out there that like some research could inform us on, but I'll have to look into that.
What's the youngest Tommy John you've rehabbed?
14. Yeah, I was
Okay.
a 8th grader, 14. And it's always, when they're that age, it's always because they're like too big for their own good, and they're like throwing harder than they were. Like there's a huge spike in how hard they're throwing from maybe 6 months earlier. And like the adaptations that you would normally get from progressively throwing a little bit harder, getting a little bit bigger and stronger, like just didn't happen. And they had some sort of growth spurt where it was just too stressful for the arm, and they were throwing harder than they normally were. So then they were also probably, because they were throwing harder than they normally were, their coach was probably then using them more because they were probably more successful performance. So then it's kind of like just a vicious cycle. But I've also seen where if they're lucky enough at that age, they don't tear their UCL, they just have an avulsion fracture where they don't need Tommy John. But again, it's still a situation where you need surgery. Like they'll put a screw into your medial epicondyle, and you kind of go through a similar progression. It's definitely not like a year-long situation like a Tommy John, but it's still a full, 24 weeks minimum of getting back to like a full throwing situation for like.
Well, is that because if you didn't get surgery, eventually you're going to have that floating piece of bone in there that's going to limit mechanics in the joint? Is that kind of the idea behind it?
Just because like your UCL, like the UCL tissue didn't tear, the ligament didn't tear itself, it just pulled the bone off because your apophysis is still like used, and it's all like a growth plate issue.
Right.
So that's where it might be like, if that doesn't happen, then it's little leaguer's elbow, which is just like apophysitis of your medial epicondyle. So that's the progression, is like apophysitis, and then it's like, or you have an avulsion fracture, or you tear your UCL. And usually if you're younger, you don't get to the point where you tear your UCL. But yeah, 14 is pretty young.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be getting better for a while. So you're probably going to stay busy.
Yeah, definitely. And at this point, it's like over the last 8 months or so, it's been like one new one per month almost. But they're doing well, and typically like it's a successful surgery. Like if you just kind of like follow a logical progression and everybody's got to be strength training. There has to be some sort of training involved. Like that is 100% required of me in my rehab, is that you're actually training. And thankfully, like nobody is saying no to that, because like I don't know what I would do if they did. Like say like, oh well, good luck.
Yeah.
There's just, and like our good friend of ours, John O'Neill, director of training at CSP, he was saying like just general strength and just getting stronger and bigger gives you options later. So it allows you to be stronger and more resilient, or more powerful, more resilient, and kind of just progress more. So general strength training is definitely a huge part of any sort of rehab, Tommy John rehab.
Cool. Well, I mean, kind of out of time here, but definitely want to get deeper into this with you. But I think that was a good introduction to some of the work you're doing.
Definitely. Loved it.
All right.
Thanks, Douglas. Keep it real, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. For 10% off our continuing education membership platform, please use promo code PODCAST at our website, resilientperformance.com, and be sure to join our mailing list for monthly exclusive content.